gives room for monetary easing, which will then stimulate the economy through credit for both consumption and investment. So that's really like at the base level, because obviously like a weaker dollar has implications, in even at the micro level, but at the very macro level at least, it's lower imported costs. And for companies, it also means lower input price pressures. So that also means lower producer price. So you have a bit more room to increase your profit margins, or even just pass lower prices to consumers, which then stimulate demands. That's the base effect of the dollar being weak and the rand being strong. But as you mentioned at the beginning, there is one portion of the economy, which are companies that are exposed to the US in terms of exports, for which the US is a market. So in South Africa, we're thinking here mostly about automotive and metals. Obviously, a stronger rand means that South African exports are less competitive relative to local US producers. And so for these industries that already face high tariffs, so for instance, 25% on cars or 50% on steel and aluminum, although there are rumors that the Trump administration also lowered that because American companies are also feeling the pressure. It does mean that it makes the US market less accessible, which can be an issue for some companies.
And that, as you mentioned, is not just about the South African rand, but it certainly does present challenges for export-oriented industries that you've mentioned, like the automotive sectors and metals as well. But despite these headwinds, which sectors of the South African economy are likely to benefit the most from a softer dollar?
So basically, in South Africa, you're looking like mostly at industries, because basically what this means is that you have a weaker dollar. So that means that US imports are cheaper. So most of what South Africa imports from the US is, besides oil, but and commodities are already traded in dollars. So here we're talking more about other types of goods. Is basically high-value machinery, aeronautics equipment, precision equipment, car and car parts also, although South Africa is a net exporter to the US, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. So all of these industries will benefit from lower input costs. And as I said, it will perhaps enable them to increase their profit margins a bit. But I have to put a caveat, is that these industries would benefit from the dollar being weaker, but that does not solve the issues that the South African industries are facing as a whole, which is basically low demand and supply side constraints and energy supply issues. Those remain. So it's just a bit of breathing room, but it does not solve at all the issues of industries.
You have written an analytical piece about this. And in that piece, you point out that a weaker dollar reduces the cost of servicing dollar-denominated debt. How can companies with exposure to dollar debt position themselves to actually take advantage of this environment?
I mean, it's a very broad issue. I would say that, for companies, basically what's happening right now with the US dollar is basically out of the control of South African companies, right? So they just have to adapt to an environment that can also shift. I mean, the dollar is weak right now, and we expect it to remain weak in 2026, but a lot can happen. We have seen in recent years that, cycles can shift very quickly. So, regarding the debt, I mean, it depends on many factors other than the dollar, which is the interest rate at which it was contracted, the maturities, a number of planned payments that you have during the year. But basically, to me personally, it's that that your debt servicing costs will be lower, your dollar-denominated debt, your external debt. So this means that for companies that are in a tight financial position, that have cash flow issues, well, it's an opportunity to build some buffers in order to, be able to withstand future economic shocks, or just the dollar reappreciating, by the way. And for companies that have sufficient liquidity, that are well capitalized, well, the savings that you made because the dollar is weak and because you're paying less interest, well, you can reinvest it into your production system or into, workforce or any other type of investment, basically.
I mean, you mentioned the kind of buffer that a weaker dollar offers countries that are in debt. And in the article, you also suggest that this could also help the South African Reserve Bank by giving it some room in order to cut the interest rates in this year. So given the economic conditions in the country, is a rate cut likely at the next MPC meeting, or is it still a bit too early to expect a shift in policy?
I would say that considering the decision that was made in January, which was to hold rates, and I think that in the monetary policy it was 2 for and 4 against. I think that for the next meeting, it's possible that they still hold rates. The reason is that indeed, as I said, like a weaker dollar means a stronger rand, means less imported inflation, which basically means that it lowers inflationary pressures, right? But at the same time, that is not the only driver. Obviously, the exchange rate is an important driver, but there are all other drivers that are important in terms of price pressures. And the fact is that right now, inflation is trending towards the upper end of the tolerance band, so it's around 3.6%. And the central banks also has in mind that we are likely to see some food price pressures, mainly because of animal diseases in the livestock industry, as well as electricity price pressures. We know that NERSA is going to increase prices by around 8.8% this year and 8% similar for next year. So this means that on the consumer price basket, there are still price pressures. So this means that basically, obviously, there is room because the inflation target has shifted to 3%. In the medium term, there is room to lower rates. That's why they shifted the targets. That's why the central bank has clearly stated that the policy rate level would be structurally lower. But here in the near term, they might wait simply because there are price pressures, even on other determinants than the exchange rate. So the weak dollar gives more room, but it's not the only condition to cut rates. So it's quite possible that they hold rates at the next meeting, but it will all depend on what the inflation figures are for January and February.
Let's do some projections as we conclude our conversation this afternoon, Aroni. In a period of a year since January 2025, the US dollar dropped about 10% of its value against the major currencies. You highlighted the reasons behind that, and a lot of these reasons are actually still very active as we speak, and we don't know. They could intensify, they could not, but they still continue to be threats that do impact the dollar and do impact global movements. Is this depreciation likely to continue, or could there be an upswing once again?
For now, at COFAS, we do expect the depreciation to continue based on the drivers, and that's what I was talking about. It's about the medium-term drivers, in the sense that if we put away the short-term volatility and the policymaking, which is going to have effects, but on the medium term, I mean, see, the Trump administration wants to have an expansionary fiscal policy, so that is going to put more question on the sustainability of U.S. debt, and investors are likely to price that. At the same time, regarding the Fed, well, on the Fed side, there is political pressure, obviously, to lower rates. But even as I mentioned before, is that just if you look at the balance between growth, employment, and price stability, the Fed is likely to cut rates. So these drivers are likely to remain this year, which is basically further depreciation pressures on the dollar. However, I mean, as you said, like shifts can happen very easily, even shifts on the opposite side, because it's very hard to forecast investor confidence. It's not something that is easy to predict. So for us, the medium-term drivers point towards still a weak dollar, but at the same time, there could be movements on the other side as well. It would not be surprising.
No, it certainly wouldn't. Nothing is surprising nowadays. Aroni Chaduri, thank you so much for your insight this afternoon. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
He is the COFAS Chief Africa Economist, taking us to exactly 4:51.
Ritmos e Cultura, com Jacob Tivani.
E os ouvintes do Ritmos e Cultura, hoje em linha com uma das grandezas da música moçambicana, porque não? Ele que é um dos kings da marrabenta, uma bermuda in the building.
É um prazer enorme estar a fazer parte deste programa. Deixe-me só saudar. Boa tarde a todos os ouvintes que me ouvem neste preciso momento. Meu nome é Uma Bermuda, já lá o Fanelo Estarapo, gajo de água da Canhela é Mabiscato. Eu vou saudar de uma maneira diferente. Ah, titabuia, mwanango, tiduma tifika guiane. Titavuya mwanango, tiduma tifika kiane. Ani motivelwa baba yena otiva mina haikonama. Ani motivelwa nona yena otiva wahimbo watwa. Cá estou eu, irmão, para conversarmos, para falarmos um pouco de tudo. Estou aqui, estou aberto. Eu estou muito feliz porque é a primeira vez que eu falo nesta rádio, falo para os ouvintes, então estou muito feliz.
Ritmos e cultura com Jacob Tivani. Todos os domingos das 20 às 21 horas.
Stay ahead with Africa in Business, where Thami Ngubeni unpacks your go-to source for Africa's economic trends and development.
In about 7 minutes' time, Africa in Business will be handing the reins over to our French desk, and Vue d'Afrique, which is captained by none other than Joël Motiba, here with us this afternoon. Bonjour, madame,
Bonjour
and
toi,
happy
Thami.
Radio Day to you.
Happy Radio Day to you too. Bonne journée internationale de la radio à vous, auditeurs, également. Et donc aujourd'hui, justement, on parlera de la célébration ce 13 février 2026 de la journée mondiale de la radio. Nous parlerons également du Cameroun. Pas toujours de remise en liberté pour près de 150 personnes interpellées dans le cadre des tensions post-électorales. Et en deuxième partie avec Jolino Sungu en sport, il sera notamment question du président de la Fédération kenyane de football qui confirme la tenue de la CAN 2027. C'est tout à l'heure sur Vue d'Afrique. Merci de rester connecté. Merci Thami.
Merci beaucoup. She's with you at the top of the hour.
Stay ahead with Africa in Business, where Thami Ngubeni unpacks your go-to source for Africa's economic trends and development.
Let's take a look at developments in Kenya. The country is grappling with a worsening drought that is devastating livelihoods across nearly half of the country. The government has set aside billions of shillings in emergency response funds, but the hardest hit lowland regions, pastoralists say help is yet to reach them. Our Nairobi correspondent Daniel Omide now reports on the human and economic toll of this crisis.
Kenya has been hit by a biting drought. The Deputy President Kithure Kindiki, speaking last weekend in Nairobi, announced that the government had set aside about 4 billion Kenya shillings. That's approximately about 31 million US dollars in emergency response, while appealing for about half of that amount from the donor community. Pastoralists and farmers from Kenya's lowland areas have been the most impacted by this drought, having received depressed rainfalls in 2025. We spoke to a few pastoralists in Kajiado County, just about 80 kilometers from Nairobi, and this is what they had to say.
The issue of food, as you can see, there is no food. The people here can't grow crops. They're not doing anything else. You can see how the drought has greatly impacted our livelihoods.
The drought has finished our flock. We only have very few left. We are hungry. Our children are malnourished. They can't even go to school. Our children want food, but we have nothing to help them with.
Those narrations that you've just heard there, though desperate, do not begin to tell half of the story. You walk in the area and you can feel the impact of this drought in the air, the scorching sun, the malnourished animal, and in some cases, strewn carcasses all over. There's little vegetation, and even the streams that serve both humans and their animals have all dried up in the area. Women have to walk long distances just to fetch water. That situation is even worse when you drive up to the northern part of the country. Over the past week, we've seen it playing on our TV screens. Images of dried up and cracked earth, dead animal carcasses. Some pastoralists have even lost up to 80% of their flock, and with the few remaining severely malnourished. We've seen images of parents, faces bowed out of helplessness, carrying weak and again malnourished children. This situation is affecting almost half of the country. Last year, while other parts of the country received adequate rainfalls during the long rains period, lowland areas received very little rainfall, and this was compounded further by even very little rainfall across the entire country during the short rains period. The National Drought Management Authority, which is a government body mandated with drought response, say the food situation in the country is stressed, with lowland areas most impacted as water and pasture conditions continue to deteriorate. I had a conversation with Kwame Owino, an economist and CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. I started by asking him, what the impact of this drought is on Kenya's economy. Listen to what he had to say.
The major driver of inflation in Kenya tends to be oil prices together with food. And if both are elevated or rising, then obviously inflation tends to be very high and the difficulty goes all the way to households. So while I can't tell at this moment what its effects on growth are, I think it will tame the prospects for growth for this year, especially the calendar year, because most severe effects of the growth of the failure of last year's rains and will be felt in this year because the harvest will be low, food prices will probably go up.
But if you look at it from the context of the state of the current economy where we are in, where we've seen the problems we've had with secondary school admissions and capitations. Do you think adding this additional spending would be sustainable in Kenya's, when you look at Kenya's already stretched public finances?
If you consider what it takes to respond to a drought, I mean, as every economist knows, but it is not too difficult to respond to a drought, and there are very cost-effective ways. So if you ask me, even if, touch wood, even if the 2 billion shillings that is expected per month were not available, and the government of Kenya needed to pay 6 billion per month for 6 months, that amount of money, if you consider it relative to the amount of taxes collected based on the best month for government, it would be equivalent to a week of tax collection. So in my view, I mean, I'm just trying to be circumspect, because the government of Kenya, based on last year's numbers and an average estimate, collects about 7 billion per day. So if you're going to spend 60 billion to respond to a tax system, I mean, to a shock such as a big drought and a famine that may to prevent famines, then you're talking about 42 billion shillings per week, and therefore about less than 10 days of spending to be able to respond adequately.
As at the time of going to press, that aid that the government had talked about had not started getting to the household that need it most. And while this may look like something the government can effectively manage on paper, it will be highly dependent on how fast the required food can reach the households that need it, and how well the rains will perform during the coming long rain season that's expected to start in March. Should the rains be as they were last year,